All right. Well, I wanted to get into chapter 3, struggles with mateships, because obviously, if we're talking about family violence and criminal activity that takes place within the family, these aren't things that go right, right? It's things that go wrong within the mateship. And so, in reading this, I did want to point out that remember that David Buss is really giving us an evolutionary viewpoint of conflict within mateships. And a lot of this is not directly in line with how we do relationships today. What might be advantageous back tens of thousands of years ago, it's not advantageous today. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're reading through, and because I know it's sort of depressing at times. It's sort of a negative view of humanity. But remember, it's really an evolutionary reason why a lot of these things are underneath our consciousness. They're things that aren't super obvious today, but do lie underneath the surface of why we do certain things, particularly in the dating phase. So nowadays we have something called marriage, where you're committed to somebody else. You're not looking to get into other relationships. And our society has solved some of those earlier problems within mateships that really cause us to struggle. But still, there are behaviors that we do and conflicts that we get into because of our evolutionary history, and things that may have been advantageous in the past that still lie a little bit dormant underneath the surface, but do have a place to play in terms of our behavior. And so he gets into this idea of mating harmony. And he says, okay, if we could pick the most perfect relationship, it would have these requirements. And certainly today, we do not have these requirements. And for the most part, it doesn't harm our relationships. It doesn't harm our marriages. However, in our evolutionary past, if we had to pick the best relationship, it would have a set of requirements. And first is monogamy. It's long-term committed mating with zero chance of infidelity. And that's what we aim for today, right? We get married, we have a partner, and we're supposed to be in this committed relationship. And we don't cheat on each other, whether that be emotionally, psychologically, or emotionally. And again, in the past, that would be advantageous too. It would definitely cut down on conflict, but it would also increase the chances that you have a loving relationship where you share resources and take care of children together. The second requirement is mutually produced offspring. So again, you would be in a relationship where you're committed and you have children, and you mutually put forth resources and care to make sure that that child's well-being is taken care of. The third requirement is absence of stepchildren. Again, in our evolutionary past, this would not be advantageous. You would not want to waste your resources on someone else's children, whether you're a mother or you're a father. You wouldn't want to put forth that effort to take care of some children that are not related to you, or only somewhat related to you. Again, today, people have stepchildren, they adopt. Our world is a lot different than it was tens of thousands of years ago. However, we do see that there are conflicts around stepchildren. Stepchildren are more likely to be murdered. They're more likely to be physically and sexually assaulted. So there are still reasons why we might see increased violence against stepchildren. And part of that might be because of our evolutionary past. Fourth is this zero chance of abandonment or breakup. You're in a committed relationship, you have children, and you're not going to abandon that relationship. You're not going to say, it's not necessarily infidelity. It could just be like, I don't want to be in this relationship, so I'm getting out of it. I'm going somewhere else, regardless of whether I find another mate or not. Obviously, that reduces resources, and it reduces the commitment to take care of children. The fifth requirement is absence of prior entangling commitments. Again, in today's society, divorce is pretty common, over 50% in many societies. Multiple relationships, serial monogamy, those types of things are pretty common in our society today. But in the past, you wouldn't want to bring in those prior commitments into a marriage. And still today, it's a deal breaker. That if you're dating later on in life, some people say, I don't want children. So if you have children, we're not going to be in a relationship. It might be a spouse that someone is taking care of. Even though they may be split up or divorced, they still feel an obligation to take care of that individual. And so that's a prior entanglement, a prior commitment that can reduce resources from that current relationship. And finally, in terms of evolutionary harmony, it would be that each member of the couple die at the same time. Again, for reasons that I think are obvious once you read this, and that is you want to live a long, happy life together. And when one person dies, you wouldn't want the living spouse to go on and have another relationship and spend the resources dedicated to the family that was created by those two original couple to be spent on someone else, especially if you have additional children in the mix after that person passes away. So for evolutionary harmony, both of those individuals of the couple would die at the same time. And again, discrepancies do come up. It's inevitable. And for those of you in the class that are in committed relationships or have had long-term relationships that are married, it's not easy, right? It's difficult. And so there is conflict that comes up. And some of that is really easily explainable by an evolutionary history. Others is more related to current day cultural issues that really play a part in why people have conflict within their families and within their intimate relationships. And one thing we're going to talk about is desirability. Obviously, both males and females have a certain level of desirability, and that changes over time. It does not remain static. Someone gets a promotion at their job, earns more money, their desirability goes up a little bit. You have a disease or you get very sick, your desirability might go down. You cost more to that family. And again, this is not saying that our culture should operate on these sort of ideas and these perspectives. But again, dealing with this from an evolutionary history, those things in terms of desirability are things that can make, the resources expended at your expense go up or down as well. And so he talks a lot about mate insurance. And again, this is not generally what we think about in terms of committed marriages, but when you're dating, when you're trying to find somebody, it's always sort of advantageous to have multiple people that you could fall back on if the relationship doesn't work. And if you don't think your marriage is going to work, then you may have sort of backup husbands and backup wives. If this doesn't work out, I have this sort of ace in the hole. This person I can go back to that I think I could make a family with, or at least a committed relationship with. And so this idea of having someone in your wings is advantageous from an evolutionary standpoint. There's a replacement mate that if something catastrophic were to happen, you have this backup. And backups can serve temporary functions, psychological support, sexual fulfillment. If breakup inflicts blows to self-esteem, those backups can offer a boost, and they can also offer protection, provisions, shields against the hostile forces of nature. So there's multiple functions that those backup males and females can serve in the real world. And so it really was essential to have mate insurance for our ancestors back, again, tens of thousands of years ago. So if this is what all these things that would cause harmony and lead towards fulfillment and having children and having resources to take care of those children, if that was number one in our evolutionary past, and having a committed long-term relationship where you both have obligations and responsibilities to one another to provide resources and care, why is there infidelity? We know that infidelity is the leading cause of divorce worldwide. It's a major reason for conflict in the relationship. And so men, if you look at this, have often evolved a strong desire for sexual variety. On average, that's stronger than women's, leading to this asymmetry in parental investment. Or parental investment is a cause for this variety. If you have to carry a child for almost 10 months, then provide care for that infant, you want a man that's going to stay with you, help you take care of that child. Where for a man, again, in evolutionary history, don't equate it with kind of how we do things today. didn't need to stay with that child. They could have children with multiple women and really have no real biological obligation for that child. So adding sex partners for women really doesn't make sense. But for men, it is, and it can increase their reproductive success. That women cannot reproduce in the 10 months that they're carrying children. It's also much less likely that they will immediately after having a child, because of a bunch of biological processes that makes that very difficult. So you're thinking of at least a year of investment where a female cannot reproduce, or for men, they can basically reproduce at any point in time. So having multiple partners increases their reproductive success, where additional partners really doesn't do much for the woman. And so he talks about this idea of mate switching, a scientifically supported idea that women have affairs to extricate themselves from a poor mateship and a trade up to a better partner. So men cheat, again, maybe for sexual variety, increasing their chances of reproductive success. But why do women cheat if we just said that it really doesn't add in much reproductive advantage? Well, the idea might be that they still can trade up. They can do better with another partner, especially if that original partnership is abusive, if it's manipulative and coercive, that they might want to get another partner so that they can have a more long-lasting, healthy relationship. So there is always this idea of competition and conflict with members of our own species. In our evolutionary past, we have these relationships and these collaborations to keep us safe, but we also are threatened by people of our own species. And so we have to think about this when we're talking about the mating market as well. And he goes into this idea of the welfare trade-off ratio. And that is the ratio of how much value you place on the welfare of your relative, your spouse, in association with your own welfare. Do you only think about yourself, or do you also think about the welfare of your spouse? Obviously, there's a ratio. You can't put everything into your spouse and completely neglect yourself. And then obviously it's not a good idea to only think about yourself and not think about the welfare of your spouse at all. And so there's a ratio of how much you do this. Is it half and half? Is it 60-40? How does this work out? And so one study found that women are most likely to evade their partner's mate guarding efforts precisely around their most fertile phase. This idea, when they are able to have children, they're not going to want to be coerced and manipulated by their partner. And this is most pronounced among women that are partnered with low attractiveness in their men. So again, what does this really have to do with the ratio? Well, obviously, one part of this is interest. Does the potential mate show attention, attraction, desire to that individual? What is the mate value? Is there a value of the current partner that if you were to break up with that individual and not have them around, does it cost you anything? Is that person eligible? Are they interested in alternative, other encumbering commitments, like an existing spouse or other dependent children? And so if all of those things are sort of met in the relationship, you have a high sort of desirability, and there might be a little bit of a discrepancy in the welfare ratio there. Again, we see this when women initiate affairs. It's more likely that they suffer from marital dissatisfaction than women who do not. So it really is something that's going on in that current relationship that makes them want to change their mate, or mate switch, as we call it. So in terms of resource infidelity, sexual conflict, again, you can cheat on your spouse sexually, and that's one reason for breakups. But we can also do this by sharing resources that should be for the family with another individual or with another family. So when it is advantageous for one partner to have an affair or trade up in the mating market, obviously the possibility for resource infidelity opens up. And financial infidelity is not uncommon. It is one reason that people split up, is that you're cheating by sharing resources. So financial disagreements turn out to be one of the strongest predictors of divorce. Sexual infidelity is still the number one, but financial disagreement is right up there. In financial dishonesty and sharing resources outside the family is a big idea, a big reason why there's a lot of divorce and breakups. So what we see is when men want to show that they're worthwhile, that they have something of value, they most likely do this by spending money on luxury goods. That is a cue for other people that they have a bounty that others lack. I have a good job, I have a lot of money, I can afford a nice car, I can afford a nice watch. And look at me, you want to be with me because I have all this money and I don't even need it for food and shelter. I can waste that on whatever I want. Where when women want to show that they have worth in the relationship, it's most likely in terms of physical beauty, that they are sexually reproductive, that you would want to be them because they would have children that are also attractive, that would attract mates. And so where men kind of flaunt their status in society and their material income, women often portray their sexual and physical traits as opposed to sort of the financial aspect of this. Now, that's not always true, and that's changing in our culture. But when we generally look at our past and we look at mating, it's sort of on average what we see. And as always, high-scoring dark triad individuals, whether they be male or female, are more likely to cheat and abandon current relationships. And there's certainly double standards that we see as sources of conflict in mateships. And it's the me versus thee standard, that if I do it, it's okay. So if I flirt a little bit, I share resources with somebody on the side, that's okay, but I don't want my mate to do it. And they shouldn't want to do it because I'm such a great person to have in this relationship. Well, that's a double standard. You can't say that you are able to do things if your partner is not able to do certain things. Well, I'm trustworthy, so I can go out with friends on the weekend, but I don't want my mate to do that. Well, that's a double standard, and that's going to create a lot of conflict within the marriage. And we often do see this quite a bit in relationships that don't end up in a good place. And one reason we see some of this discrepancy is sort of biological or biopsychological. Things like men on average have much more circulating testosterone than women. And that can lead to more sexual selection, wanting more sexual partners. It can also lead to more aggressiveness, particularly when we get into mate guarding and when we get into fighting in conflict related to jealousy. And jealousy is a really powerful emotion that we're going to talk a lot more about in the next few chapters. But on average, overall, both women and men want partners who appreciate their sexual relationship, who find them sexually alluring, that want to be in committed relationships. So all of those things that we value in current day society, those are advantageous. They do lead to having more offspring, healthier offspring, more grandchildren. And obviously, we also value and want more things today in our culture than just having children and having grandchildren. There's a lot of other things that come into play that were not available to our ancestors that certainly are things that we have to think about. But in terms of this book and David Buss, he is talking about these underlying sort of dormant things and factors that do play a part, at least partially, in determining our behavioral outcomes. And so as we move forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea, this emotion of jealousy, when we do have conflict in relationship, and then a little bit later on in a few chapters, talk about how this really comes into play in terms of family violence. So this is really setting up our further discussion on why there's conflict, particularly violent conflict within relationships.